Good morning, Internet. I'm looking at my hair and I see I look like a poodle, but it is what it is. My apologies for not having chapter 4 up yesterday. This week got away from me. I'm going to go back to my original idea and record a couple chapters at a time and have them prepped and all good to go. So thanks again for being patient. I appreciate that about you. All right. We are now up to chapter 4. As we know, the Bennets have met Bingley and Darcy at the ball. Darcy's a dick. Bingley's in love with Jane. And Mrs. Bennet remains as vexed as ever. So we're on to chapter 4. Chapter 4. When Jane and Elizabeth were alone, the former, who had been cautious in her praise of Mr. Bingley before, expressed to her sister how very much she admired him. "He is just what a good man ought to be," said she, "sensible, good-humoured, lively, and I never saw such happy manners, and so much ease, with such perfect good breeding." "He is also handsome," replied Elizabeth, "which a young man ought to be like what a young man ought likewise to be, if he possibly can. His character is therefore complete. I was very much flattered by him asking me to dance a second time. I did not expect such a compliment." "Did not you?" "I did for you. But that is one great difference between us. Compliments always take you by surprise, and me never. What could be more natural than his asking you again? He could not help seeing that you were about 5 times as pretty as every other woman in the room. No thanks to his gallantry for that. While he certainly is very agreeable, and I give you leave to like him, you have liked many a stupider person." Do you remember in the movie, the 2005 movie, Mrs. Bennet, after Jane and Bingley had danced, I think at least once, she comments to the group that when Jane was but 15, a gentleman had wrote her a very pretty verse, but of course nothing came out of it. "Dear Lizzie, oh, you are a great deal too apt, you know, to like people in general. You never see a fault in anybody. All the world are good and agreeable in your eyes. I never heard you speak ill of a human being in my life. I would wish not to be hasty in censoring anyone, but I always speak what I think. I know you do, and that is what makes me wonder, with your good sense, to be honestly blind to the follies and nonsense of others. Affection of candor is common enough. One meets it everywhere. But to be candid without ostentation or design, to take good care of everybody's character and make it still better, and say nothing of the bad, belongs to you alone. And so, you like this man's sister too, do you? Their manners are not equal to his." Well, we already know that Caroline's a bitch. "Certainly not, at first, but they are very pleasing women whom you converse with them. Miss Bingley is up to live with her brother and keep his house, and I am much mistaken if we shall not find a very charming neighbor in her." Elizabeth listened in silence, but was not convinced. Their behavior at the assembly had not been calculated to please in general, and with more quickness of observation and less pliancy of temper than her sister, and with a judgment too unassailed by other attention to herself, she was very little disposed to approve them. They were in fact very fine ladies, not deficient of good humour when they were pleased, nor in the power of being agreeable when they chose it, but proud and conceited. Sounds like somebody we know. They were rather handsome, had been educated in one of the finest private seminaries in town, had a fortune of £20,000, was in a habit of spending more than they ought, and of associating with people of rank, and were therefore in every respectful entitled to think well of themselves, and meanly of others. So they're snobs. They were of a respectable family in the north of England, a circumstance more deeply impressed on their memories than their brother's fortune and their own had been acquired by trade. Mr. Bingley inherited property to the amount of nearly £100,000 from his father, who had intended to purchase an estate, but did not live to do it. Mr. Bingley intended it likewise, and sometimes made choice of his country, but he was now provided with a good house and the library of a manor. It was doubtful to many of those who best knew the easiness of his temper, whether he might not spend the remainder of his days at Netherfield, and leave the next generation to purchase. His sisters were very anxious to his having an estate of his own, but though he was now established only as a tenant, Miss Bingley was by no means unwilling to preside at this table, nor was Mrs. Hurst, who had married a man of more fashion than fortune, less disposed to consider his house as her home when it suited her. Mr. Bingley had not been of age 2 years when he was tempted by an accidental recommendation to look at Netherfield House. He did not look He did not look at it and into it for half an hour, was pleased with the situation and the principal rooms, satisfied with what the owner said in praise, and took it immediately. Between him and Darcy there was a very steady friendship in spite of great opposition of character. Bingley was endeared to Darcy by the easiness, openness, docility of his temper, though no disposition could offer a greater contrast to his own. And though with his own he never appeared dissatisfied. On the strength of Darcy's regard, Bingley had the firmer resilience, and of his judgment the highest opinion. In understanding, Darcy was the superior. Bingley was by no means deficient, but Darcy was clever. He was at the same time haughty, reserved, fastidious, and his manners, though well-bred, were not inviting. At that respect his friend had greatly the advantage. Bingley was sure of being liked whenever he appeared, and Darcy was continually giving offense. As we know, in chapter 3, when everybody meets Darcy at the assembly, they all think he's, hot shit, and then his behavior and his attitude toward the general populace, everybody decides he's a dick. The manner in which they spoke of the Meryton assemblies were sufficient characteristic. Bingley had never met with pleasanter people or prettier girls in his life. Everybody had been most kind and attentive to him. There had been no formality, no stiffness, and he soon felt acquainted with all the room. And as to Miss Bennet, he could not conceive an angel more beautiful. Darcy, on the contrary, had seen a collection of people in whom there was little beauty and no fashion, for none of whom he had felt the smallest interest, and from none received either attention or pleasure. Miss Bennet he acknowledged to be pretty, but she smiled too much. Are you serious? Like, what? Mrs. Hurst and her sister allowed it to be so, but still they admired her and liked her, and pronounced her to be a sweet girl, and one whom they should not object to know more of. Miss Bennet was therefore established as a sweet girl, and their brother felt authorized by such commendation to think of her as he chose. End of chapter 4. Okay, so in this chapter, to some, we have learned that the relationship of Bingley and Darcy, how it got together, and we also learned that Elizabeth and Jane had their conversation about what happened after the assembly. And if you remember the 2005 movie, they're underneath the sheet giggling like crazy, which I enjoy. Also, in the 2005 movie, there's a scene where Jane is walking and Bingley is behind her, and he goes and grabs her frock, and just the mere touch of it, brings pleasure to his face. If I keep referencing the 2005 movie more than the 1995 version, it is simply because I have seen that version more often than not, and I haven't watched the 1995 version in like 100 years. Anywho, that's it for chapter 4. I'll see you Tuesday for chapter 5.